We've been looking at the last week of Jesus' physical life, looking at different events that have taken place, and we're in a section now where we're looking at the various trials that Jesus endured as he approached the end of his life here. And we found that he had the trial of sorrow, dealing with his emotional turmoil. He was tried in the minds of men, the crowd that came and where they viewed him and how they looked at him. He was also tried by Judas's pretense, his hypocrisy, his kiss of friendship in betrayal. And the last time we looked at this subject matter, we saw the despair of the disciples, how they allowed a spirit of defeatism to conquer them, and so they flee when Jesus is arrested. We're going to continue today to look at the next event as Jesus is led out of the garden. And we're going to begin to look at the injustice that was done to him under Jewish law. The reason for the reading in Leviticus is because God had made it very plain that judging people for the Jewish nation, that was to be done justly, that there was not to be a prejudice in that judgment, that it was to be done fairly. And what we're going to find is that Jesus is far from treated with that sense of fairness. And I think what really strikes me about looking at the trial of Christ is not just the facts, but this actually proves the innocence of Jesus. It becomes for us today the proof that we can anchor to Christ because he is the only sinless human being that ever lived. And when even brought before an unjust judicial system, they couldn't find anything by which they could accuse him. And so he truly is the perfect sacrifice for you and for me. We're going to look at the unjust Jewish trial of Jesus. Scripture gives us detail about how all of this unfolds. It's unjust. However, it's truly magnified when we look at the nature of Jewish justice. The contrast is phenomenal, and so that's what I would like for us to do. We're going to begin to look at how the Jews regulated this whole concept of judgment and trial and witnesses and how they put this all together. It primarily develops from a text found in Deuteronomy chapter 16. And here's what God had told them. You shall appoint for yourselves judges and officers in all your towns which the Lord your God is giving you according to your tribes. And they shall judge the people with righteous judgment. You shall not distort justice, you shall not be partial, and you shall not take a bribe. For a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and perverts the words of the righteous. Justice and only justice you shall pursue, that you may live and possess the land which the Lord your God is giving you. That text contains a number of specific instructions. Among those, there were to be local judges. They were to select local judges according to their tribes. They were to judge in fairness and in righteousness. Judgment was never to be about distorting the truth. That was not permissible in the Jewish justice system. There was not to be any practice of partiality that was to be shown and demonstrated in the Jewish law. There was never to be a bribe that was to be taken, and the primary objective was to administer justice and only justice. So those are the principles that governed the Jewish understanding of trial. So what happened is they developed from that a very specific system. And you will just notice how that as we look at some of that system that, it really parallels the system that you and I are familiar with. The system of justice that's practiced in America, our legal system, as well as those in any, equitable country, all of those countries function in the same basic way when it comes to administering justice. We read a lot about, especially in the news of late, countries that have not that kind of justice system. to administer justice by who knows what, by the whim of a dictator, by the will of a president, and they administer justice however they decide to mete out that justice. What the Jews did is they took the passage in Deuteronomy chapter 16 and they began to make specific application of it. In other words, they decided, how are we going to administer this law that God has given us? Any area or region which had 120 male heads of families was by them to have a local council. That council would be called a Sanhedrin, which is a Hebrew word that just means sitting together. So anytime there were 120 males, they were to have a Sanhedrin council. That particular council was to be made up of 23 judges or individuals. They never had an even number. There was never going to be a tie in the Jewish legal system. They acted as not just judges, but they were also the jury in all legal matters. Villages that were too small to have a council were told to pick 3 or 7, depending on the size of the community, individuals who could function as judges. And they, again, were set up to render verdicts in criminal cases. Regardless of the size, whether it was 23 or whether it was 3, there was a chief ruler that was selected. And you will read often in Scripture about the chief ruler. What that is saying is he was the administrator of that particular council. Now, that did not mean that he was recognized as any great authority or having greater authority than any other member of the council, but he was the one that was to make sure that things were functioning. He was to administer the function of the council. All of them served as an equal court. As the capital city, Jerusalem was the location of what was called the Great Sanhedrin. It was made up of 24 chief priests, 24 elders, 24 scribes, plus the high priest, which made for a total of 71. This was the final, if you will, court of appeals for the Jewish nation. This was like our Supreme Court. So the Jerusalem Sanhedrin was the high court among all of Judaism. Any decision that was made in a lower court, if there was going to be any appeal, it would be handled by the Jewish Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin at all levels, whether you're talking about 3 individuals that were set up to judge or whether you're talking about the 71 in Jerusalem, every one of those Sanhedrin had to guarantee 3 things. And the first one is this: they guaranteed a public trial. Any accusation that was brought against any person was going to be heard in a public fashion. And again, much like our system today, our judicial system in our country gives the right to a public trial. Again, that doesn't mean they're all going to be broadcast on television, but it means the public will have access to witness the proceedings, to observe the justice as it is dealt out. There was no hidden proceedings. Everything was to be visible. Everything was to be public. Not only that, but judges then were always being scrutinized by the populace. They always were being looked at and examined as they dealt out their justice. So a public trial was a guarantee. Secondly, there was also the guarantee of the right to make self-defense, the right to defend yourself. Again, we're so accustomed to our judicial system in this country, we may forget that there are literally hundreds of nations in this world where you have no right to defend yourself. They can bring charges against you, they can execute judgment totally without you having any right to defend. The Jews said everybody has the right to self-defense. Every individual had the right to a defender and the right to bring in witnesses that would validate their defense. That was a guaranteed right under Jewish law. Thirdly, every Sanhedrin also made sure that no one could be convicted by anyone without witness to the accusation. And they were very, very specific about the nature of a witness. A witness had to be able to verify factual information. Verifiable testimony had to be available. And we will read throughout Jewish law that there will always be the response that how many witnesses have to be conferring so that there can be adequate defense? 2 or 3. The reason it says 2 or 3 is not because you can't count. The reason it says 2 or 3 is because it depends on whether you're counting the first witness and the other 2 that are verifying what the first one said. So basically, there's got to be 3 witnesses. There have to be 3 people that validate the accusation against any individual, a public hearing, a right to a defense, and witnesses. Being a false witness was considered a very heinous crime under Jewish law. If you gave false testimony as a witness, the punishment that was to be dealt to you as a false witness was the same punishment you were trying to extract from the person. So what that meant is if you were giving false testimony in a criminal capital case where someone's life was going to be taken and you gave false testimony and it was found out that you gave false testimony, you were the one that would die. You would be executed. That's how seriously Jewish law took the testimony of a witness. Now, that is rooted in this biblical instruction from Deuteronomy 19. And the judges shall investigate thoroughly, and if the witness is false witness and he has accused his brother falsely, then you shall do to him just as he had intended to do to his brother. Thus you shall purge the evil from among you. So that was the common practice of the way that the Jews handled their witnesses. The witnesses whose testimony brought about the death penalty were the ones who had to cast the first stone in execution. This tended to cause people to be very certain about any testimony that they gave as a witness. You were the one who was going to execute that judgment. A gentleman named Joseph Salvador, in the testimony of the evangelist, reveals some great detail about the protocol within the Jewish system. And I just want to read some of this to you because, like I say, the contrast between Jewish law and what happened to Jesus is amazing. It is amazing, and it validates the proof of our Lord's innocence. On the day of the trial, quote, on the day of the trial, the executive officers of justice caused the accused person to make his appearance at the feet of the elders, were placed men who under the name of auditor or candidates followed regularly the sittings of the council. So they brought in the person, end of quote. So they brought in the person who was being accused, and he was put at the feet of the council. But not only was he there were auditors, observers, who were brought in and who actually viewed the proceedings. What we find out in history is that those that were those auditors, those counselors, those oftentimes became the pool from which new judges were selected. So they were in court learning what was happening, observing what was happening, making sure what was happening was in accord with what law demanded. Okay, we continue. Quote, the papers in the case were read and the witnesses were called in succession. The president addressed this exhortation to each witness. Quote, it is not conjecture or whatever public rumor has brought to you that we ask of you. Consider what a great responsibility rests upon you, that we are not occupied by an affair like a case of physical interest in which the injury may be repaired if you cause the condemnation of a person unjustly accused, his blood, and the blood of all his posterity of him, of whom you will have deprived the earth, will fall on you. And God will demand of you an account, as he demanded of Cain an account of the blood of Abel. Now speak. Whoa. End of quote. Imagine hearing that. That, by the way, is what gave birth in our country. I swear to tell the truth, whole truth, and nothing but the truth. I do. A woman could not be a witness because she would not have the courage to give the first blow to the condemned person, nor could a child that is responsible, nor a slave, nor a man of bad character, nor one whose infirmaries prevent the full employment of his physical and moral faculties. The simple confession of an individual against himself or the declaration, however renowned, would not decide a condemnation. Jewish law said that no person could testify against themselves, so the witnesses had to be validated. Continuing with this quote, we hold it to be fundamentally that no one shall prejudice himself. If a man accuses himself before a tribunal, they must not believe him unless the fact is attended to by two other witnesses. Even if a man confesses, you're on the council, you're not to believe him unless there are other witnesses to validate what he says. Wow. After an examination of these proofs, the judges who believed the party innocent stated their reasons. Those who believed him guilty spoke afterwards and with the greatest moderation. If one of the auditors was entrusted by the accused with his defense, or if he wished in his own name to present any evidence in favor of innocence, he was allowed to do that. So the individual was given the right to testify to their innocence. When the accused person himself wished to speak, they gave the most profound attention. And when the discussion was finished, one of the judges recapitulated the case and they removed all the spectators. Two scribes took down the votes of the judges. One of them noted those who were in favor of accusation, the other those who were in favor of acquittal. 11 votes out of 23 was sufficient to acquit. It required 13 to convict. If a major of votes acquitted, the accused was discharged instantly. If he was to be punished, the judges postponed pronouncing sentence until the third day. Now listen to this. And during the intermediate day, they could not be occupied with anything but the cause, and they abstained from food. You found somebody guilty, there was no sentence for 3 days. And the day in between, all of the judges fasted. And all that occupied their minds was the case. Then on the morning of the third day, they returned to the judgment seat, and each judge who was not changed his opinion said, I continue of the same option and condemn. Anyone who had first condemned might at this setting acquit. But he who had once acquitted could not change his mind to condemn. Now look at the safeguards. If I voted you guilty, but I've had time now to think and fast about this, and now I decide you're innocent, I can change my mind. But if I acquitted you, I can't condemn you. The elders sat in the seats of judgment, of the judgment hall, while the man was ushered out towards his place of execution. This was if somebody was found guilty. They placed at the entrance of the judgment hall an officer of judgment with a flag in his hand. A second officer of justice got on a horse and rode after that party headed for execution. He followed the prisoner and constantly turned around and looked back at the man with the flag. During this travel, if any person came to announce to the Sanhedrin any new evidence in favor of the prisoner, the first officer would wave his flag, and the second one, as soon as he saw it, brought back the prisoner. Jewish law, normally, as they're going out to execute the person, would have a system whereby if anybody came up with any further witness that would justify the accused, would wave the flag, and the guy on the horse would stop it all and bring the prisoner back. That's what normally happened in a Jewish trial. If the prisoner declared to the magistrates that he recollected some reason which had escaped him, some thought that had escaped him, they brought him before the judges no less than 5 times. If no incident occurred, the procession advanced slowly, preceded by a herald, to herald in front with a loud voice addressing the people. This man, and they would state his name, is led to punishment for this crime, and they would name the crime. The witnesses who have borne against him are, and they would be named. That would all be shouted out. If anyone has evidence to give in his favor, let them come forth quickly. As a man was being led forth to be executed under Jewish law, there was a herald calling for last-minute witnesses, naming those who had witnessed against. They made the man drink a stupefying beverage in order to render the approach of death less terrible, and executed him. Now, when you think about the whole scene of normal Jewish justice and compare that with how Jesus is going to be tried in their criminal system, it's appalling, the laws that were broken. Let's read what Scripture says happened. So the Roman cohort and the commander and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him, and they led him to Annas first. For he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. Now Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it was expedient for one man to die on behalf of the people. And they led Jesus away to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes gathered together, and Peter had followed him at a distance right into the courtyard of the high priest. And he was sitting with the officers and warming himself by the fire. Now the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain testimony against Jesus to put him to death, and they were not finding any. For they were giving false testimony against him, and yet their testimony was not consistent. And some stood up and began to give false testimony against him, saying, "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another made without hands.' And not even in this respect was their testimony consistent. And the high priest stood up and came forward and questioned Jesus, 'Do you make no answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you?' But he kept silent and made no answer. Again, the high priest was questioning him and saying to him, 'Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?' And Jesus said, 'I am. And you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven.' And tearing his clothes, the high priest said, 'What further need do we have for witnesses? We have heard the blasphemer. How does it seem to you?' And they all condemned him to be deserving of death. And the men who were holding Jesus in custody were mocking him and beating him, and they blindfolded him and were asking him, saying, 'Prophesy, who is the one that hit you?' And they were saying many other things against him, blaspheming. And when it was day, the council of elders of the people assembled, both chief priests and scribes, and they led him away to their council chamber, saying, 'If you're the Christ, tell us.' But he said to them, 'If I tell you, you will not believe. And if I ask a question, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God.' And they all said, 'Are you the Son of God then?' And he said to them, 'Yes, I am.' And they said, 'What further need do we have of testimony? For we have heard it ourselves from his own mouth.' And those who seized Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the chief priest, where the scribes and the elders were gathered together. But Peter also was following him at a distance as far as the courtyard of the high priest, and he entered in, and he sat down with the officers to see the outcome. Now the chief priest and the whole council kept trying to obtain false testimony against Jesus in order that they might put him to death. And they did not find any, even though many false witnesses came forward. But later on, 2 came forward and said, this man stated, 'I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days.' And the high priest stood up and said to him, 'Do you make no answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you?' But Jesus kept silent, and the high priest said to him, 'I adjure you by the living God that you tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God.'" Just want to quickly mention one part of that scene this morning, the injustice that was done toward Jesus at the house of the high priest Anna. John's account reveals that was the immediate place that Jesus went after they bound him in the garden. They took him to Annas, the high priest, the recognized high priest, if you will. He was the Roman political high priest. Caiaphas was the real Jewish high priest, and you remember Old Testament law, if you were high priest until you died. So the Jews still recognized Caiaphas, and that's why we'll read, and we've got 2 high priests going on. Well, one was the one established by the Romans. He was the son-in-law of Caiaphas. He was a very political high priest. One author said that the connection was so great between the two. In other words, Caiaphas was extremely corrupted because of the political system. Rome recognized, probably because he was more tolerant towards Rome, they recognized Annas. But the truth is, you kind of got the Jewish mafia going here. And He's making all the calls, but you've got this other guy who's filling a role. And so Jesus goes before him. The chief priests therefore questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. Now this is Annas. And Jesus answered him, I've spoken openly to the world. I also taught in the synagogues and in the temple, where all the Jews come together, and I spoke nothing in secret. Why do you question me? Question those who have heard what I spoke to them. Behold, these know what I said. And when he said this, one of the officers standing by gave Jesus a blow, saying, Is that the way you answer the high priest? And Jesus answered him, If I have spoken wrongly, bear witness of the wrong. But if rightly, why do you strike me? Annas therefore sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Annas gets the first go-around at Jesus. Now remember, what has to happen here? The Jews have to come up with some legitimate sentence that they can charge Jesus with, which will be a capital offense, so they can present to Rome, this person needs to be executed, because they, under the Roman authority, they have no legal right to exercise capital punishment. So they have to find some charge to bring against Christ. Annas and the whole count, they've made up their minds. They've already decided that Jesus needs to be taken out. Judas has given them this opportunity at this particular moment in time. Jesus must be eliminated, and they're ready to get rid of him. So illegally, remember, if someone was brought to a Jewish court, the charge was there. Illegally, Annas looks at Jesus and says, tell me about what you've been teaching. And tell me about your disciples. What are they? What are your followers? What's going on with them? No, that's not the way it was supposed to work. Jewish legal protocol demanded that the charges existed and that they were being leveled against the defendant. None existed, so Annas goes on a fishing expedition. Give me something, Jesus. We've got nothing. Give me something. And this explains Jesus' answer. I've spoken everything openly. You've heard everything I have to say. I was in the temple. I was with people. If you want to know what I've said, go ask people. I haven't been out here in any secret meetings. So, if you have a charge, let's hear it. Jesus is challenging. Jesus is recognizing Jewish law says you're supposed to have witnesses. So basically he's saying, call your witnesses. You got a charge against me, then bring on your witnesses. Now you can almost feel how this is going down. You got this political power hungry Jew. And Jesus, he has posed a question to Jesus, and Jesus says, well, if you got a charge, you bring it up. Let's hear it. And you can just kind of, you know how when you get that, then you can just feel the red going up. That had to have been where this high priest was. The red was just going up, and there was just this animosity growing, and all this turmoil, and there's somebody standing close to Jesus. He's picking up. You know how you pick up on that stuff. He's picking up on all the tension that's happening from the high priest. So what does he do? Bam! He reaches out and he hits Christ. And he says, is that how you talk to a high priest? And Jesus says, if I've done something wrong, where are the witnesses? And if you don't have the witnesses, why are you striking me? If you don't have the proof, if you don't have the testimony, if you don't have the witnesses who are willing to go on the line, then I don't deserve to be here. I am innocent. And so here is this grand jury. He's got nothing. So what does he do? Pass him on. Well, just take him on down to Caiaphas. That's where everybody's gathered. That's where they're waiting for him. So I found nothing. Take him on down there. No charges at the high priest's house. The man who gave his life, who shed his blood, was 100% innocent. Those for whom he shed his blood are 100% guilty. but a valid question for us to consider. What are we going to do with Jesus? You know, the Jews were trying to decide what they were going to do with Christ. He's making a claim to be God's son. He's giving evidence. He's preaching that that's why he is here, that he has come. He's going to tear down Judaism. He's going to build something new. They had to come up with their choice of what they were going to do with Jesus. But the question for us, you know, that one was solved way back then. The question for us today is, what are we going to do with Jesus? What are we going to do with the innocent one? The one who didn't respond because there was no way to respond to accusations that were untrue.